Imagine a king whose name still sparks fierce debate more than 500 years after his death. A ruler who sat on the English throne for barely 2 years, yet has been remembered for centuries as one of history's greatest villains. Was he truly the ruthless usurper who murdered his own nephews to steal the crown, or was he the victim of one of the most successful smear campaigns ever written? This is the mystery of Richard III, a man whose story lies at the crossroads of history, politics, and literature. His enemies called him a tyrant. Shakespeare turned him into a deformed monster, and generations have grown up believing the story of the hunchbacked king who stopped at nothing to gain power. But modern historians tell a different tale, one of a capable administrator, a brave soldier, and even a reformer who sought justice for the common people. And then there is the greatest mystery of all, the fate of the princes in the tower. Were they really his victims, or did someone else benefit from their disappearance? Richard III's legacy is not just about one man. It is about how stories are told, how winners write history, and how memory can shape a reputation more powerfully than truth. To explore him is to explore the very nature of villainy and victimhood, and the fine line that separates them. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we dive deep into the enigma of Richard III. Was he the ultimate villain of English history, or an unfairly maligned victim of propaganda? Stay with us as we uncover the competing stories, weigh the evidence, and explore why this debate refuses to die. Richard III has remained one of the most controversial figures in English history. His life, short reign, and violent death at the Battle of Bosworth have fascinated historians, dramatists, and the general public for more than 5 centuries. He was born in the early 15th century, in October of the year 1452, at Fotheringham Castle in Northamptonshire. He was the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His father was a central figure in the struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster, a conflict that came to be known as the Wars of the Roses. From birth, Richard belonged to a family deeply embedded in dynastic ambition and political turbulence. His early years were shaped by war, by shifting fortunes, and by the violent deaths of those close to him. As the youngest son of a powerful duke, Richard was not initially expected to play a dominant role in English politics. His elder brother Edward, tall, handsome, and militarily successful, would rise to become Edward IV, King of England. Another brother, George, Duke of Clarence, would pursue his own turbulent course, eventually executed for treason by Edward himself. Richard, the youngest of the 3 surviving York brothers, was known for loyalty to Edward and for his military skill from a young age. His path to power came not only through circumstance, but through service and determination. When Edward seized the throne from Henry VI in 1461, Richard was still a boy. He grew up in an environment where loyalty could be both rewarded and punished, and where survival often depended on decisive, sometimes ruthless choices. Richard was created Duke of Gloucester in his youth and took on military and administrative responsibilities in the north of England. He became known as an able commander and a trustworthy lieutenant to his brother Edward. During Edward's exile in Burgundy, when the Lancastrian forces briefly restored Henry VI to the throne, Richard followed Edward into exile and later returned with him to England. He fought with distinction at the Battle of Barnet and at the decisive Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, victories that restored Edward firmly to the throne and destroyed most of the Lancastrian leadership. In these years, Richard earned a reputation for courage, loyalty, and effective command. Unlike his brother George of Clarence, who wavered in allegiance, Richard's support for Edward remained steadfast. When Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, leaving behind 2 young sons, the succession crisis that followed brought Richard to the center of events. As uncle to the boy king, Edward V, Richard was named Lord Protector. What followed remains one of the most debated episodes in English history. Within a few months, Richard took the crown for himself, claiming that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to a pre-contract, which meant that the children were illegitimate and barred from succession. Parliament confirmed this claim through an act known as Titulus Regius. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were placed in the Tower of London and were never seen in public again. Their disappearance, and the widespread belief that they were murdered, became the darkest stain on Richard's reputation. The historical context in which Richard acted was marked by constant strife and shifting allegiances. The Wars of the Roses were not simply battles between 2 noble families, but a protracted civil conflict that tore at the fabric of English society for decades. The Yorkist claim to the throne rested on both descent and conquest, and the Lancastrian line, though weakened, still posed a threat. Usurpation, betrayal, and execution were not uncommon. For Richard, who had grown up amid battles and executions, the idea of eliminating rivals might have seemed a harsh but necessary measure. To modern eyes, his actions appear ruthless. To contemporaries, they may have appeared unsurprising, even if still shocking. The central question that has occupied historians, writers, and audiences ever since is whether Richard should be remembered as a ruthless villain or as a victim of propaganda created by his enemies. Was he a power-hungry usurper who murdered his nephews to secure his throne, or was he a capable ruler maligned by the victorious Tudors who needed to blacken his name to justify their own rule? This question touches not only on Richard's character, but on the nature of history itself. How much of what we believe about past figures is the result of evidence, and how much is shaped by the narratives of those who benefited from their downfall? The importance of this debate is considerable. Richard's reign marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, which would dominate England for over a century. The way Richard was portrayed had direct consequences for Tudor legitimacy. Henry VII, who defeated Richard at Bosworth in 1485, had a tenuous hereditary claim to the throne. His marriage to Elizabeth of York helped to strengthen his position, but his dynasty still needed to justify why it had displaced a crowned king. Casting Richard as a tyrant and a murderer gave moral weight to Henry's victory and allowed the Tudors to frame their rule as the restoration of justice and order. This political necessity found expression in both chronicles and literature. Early Tudor historians such as Polydore Virgil and later Sir Thomas More painted Richard as a deformed, malicious schemer. These accounts laid the groundwork for William Shakespeare's unforgettable dramatization of Richard in the late 16th century. Shakespeare's Richard III is one of the greatest villains in theater, a cunning manipulator who murders his way to power. Shakespeare wrote under Tudor patronage, and his play reinforced the image of Richard as the embodiment of evil. For centuries, audiences came to know Richard primarily through this dramatic lens, and the line between history and art blurred. The influence of Shakespeare's portrayal cannot be overstated. The hunchbacked, plotting, charismatic villain became embedded in English culture, shaping popular understanding of Richard for generations. Schoolchildren, theatergoers, and readers absorbed this version of Richard, often without realizing how much it owed to Tudor politics. The debate over Richard is therefore not only about the man himself, but about the power of narrative to shape historical memory. The case of Richard III shows how difficult it can be to separate fact from interpretation, especially when a dynasty had every reason to vilify a predecessor. Historiography, the study of how history is written, plays a central role in the debate. From the 17th century onward, some writers began to challenge the traditional image of Richard. In the 18th century, Horace Walpole famously defended him, arguing that Tudor historians had exaggerated his crimes. Later scholars such as Paul Murray Kendall in the 20th century presented a more balanced view, stressing his achievements as king and questioning the evidence for his alleged murders. The Richard III Society, founded in the 20th century, has worked to rehabilitate his reputation and promote new research. The discovery of Richard's skeleton in Leicester in the year 2012 reignited public interest and encouraged further reassessment. At the heart of any introduction to this subject lies the question of how we as historians, readers, or audience members choose to interpret Richard. One thesis might argue for balance, seeing Richard as both villain and victim, depending on which lens we use. His seizure of power and the disappearance of the princes cast him as a villain in the eyes of many, yet the lack of definitive evidence and the clear motivations of Tudor propagandists make him a victim of historical distortion. Another thesis might take a firmer stance, either defending him as a pragmatic ruler whose actions were consistent with the brutal politics of his time, or condemning him as a man who went further than necessary in his pursuit of power. The debate over Richard III therefore matters on several levels. It matters for English history because his reign and death marked a turning point. It matters for literature because Shakespeare's play remains one of the most powerful representations of villainy ever written. It matters for historiography because it illustrates how narratives are shaped, reshaped, and challenged over time. To consider Richard only as villain or only as victim is to simplify a complex figure. To examine both possibilities is to confront the nature of historical truth itself. The difficulty of judging Richard III begins with the evidence left by contemporaries. To understand him as a historical figure, one must look first at the chronicles and testimonies written in the years around his reign. These sources are not only fragmentary, but often contradictory, shaped by the allegiances and fears of their authors. The Croyland Chronicle, written by an anonymous cleric who likely had connections to the royal court, provides some of the most important information. It describes the events surrounding Edward IV's death, Richard's assumption of the protectorate, and the controversial execution of Lord Hastings. Yet the Chronicle, like so many medieval sources, mixes observation with moral judgment, leaving modern readers uncertain how much reflects fact and how much reflects opinion. Another valuable testimony comes from the Italian diplomat Dominic Mancini, who visited England in the months before Richard seized the crown. Mancini's account, written for an audience abroad, portrays Richard as ambitious and suggests that he imprisoned his nephews in the Tower with sinister intent. Yet Mancini left England before the boys disappeared, and much of his report is based on rumor rather than direct knowledge. His testimony carries weight because it is contemporary, but it must be read with caution. The same is true of the document known as Titulus Regius, the parliamentary act that declared Edward IV's children illegitimate. This act was the legal foundation for Richard's claim to the throne. It argued that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been unlawful due to a pre-contract with another woman. Whether this was fact or invention remains debated, but the act shows how Richard justified his usurpation within the framework of law. Henry VII, after taking power, ordered the destruction of every copy of Titulus Regius, a decision that in itself testifies to the significance of the document. When one examines Richard's short reign, the political challenges he faced become evident. He ruled for little more than 2 years, and in that time he faced continuous unrest and plots against him. The execution of Hastings, who had been one of Edward IV's most loyal allies, shocked many and raised doubts about Richard's trustworthiness. Rebellions soon followed, including Buckingham's rising in the autumn of 1483, which though unsuccessful revealed the instability of his rule. Richard also faced difficulties in securing alliances, particularly in arranging marriages that would strengthen his dynasty. The death of his only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, in 1484 left him without an heir, weakening his political position. His government, however, was not without achievements. He passed legal reforms aimed at curbing corruption and ensuring fair treatment of the poor, and he attempted to strengthen royal authority in regions that had often resisted control. These acts suggest that Richard was not solely a figure of ambition, but also a ruler trying to govern effectively in the face of constant opposition. Still, history has not remembered Richard chiefly through these chronicles or statutes. His reputation has been shaped more by literature than by archival record, and in that domain Shakespeare's play towers above all else. Richard III, as dramatized by Shakespeare in the late 16th century, is the very image of villainy. The play presents him as deformed in body and twisted in mind, a man who glories in manipulation, lies, and murder. From the opening soliloquy, Richard proclaims his determination to prove a villain, relishing the role of deceiver. He schemes against his brothers, arranges the deaths of rivals, woos Lady and beside the corpse of her father-in-law, and ultimately seizes the crown through treachery. His villainy is not merely shown in action, but celebrated in language. Shakespeare gives him wit, irony, and theatrical presence, making him one of the most compelling antagonists in drama. The devices Shakespeare uses to demonize Richard are manifold. His physical deformity, exaggerated into a hunchback with withered arm, becomes a symbol of inner corruption. His soliloquies draw the audience into complicity as he confides his plots and mocks his victims. The murders of the princes in the Tower, depicted as a direct order from Richard, serve as the emotional climax of his crimes. His eventual downfall at Bosworth, haunted by the ghosts of those he killed, gives moral resolution to the story. In this dramatic world, Richard is the clear villain, punished by divine justice and replaced by Henry Tudor, who is presented as the restorer of peace. Yet one must remember that Shakespeare was not writing impartial history. He was a playwright working under the rule of Elizabeth I, granddaughter of Henry VII. His audience had been raised on Tudor propaganda, and there was little incentive to question it. Indeed, to portray Richard sympathetically would have risked political danger. Instead, Shakespeare crafted a story that reinforced the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty by showing the horrors that preceded it. Richard became the perfect villain against whom Tudor rule could shine. The dramatization served entertainment, moral lesson, and political justification all at once. The Tudor influence on Shakespeare's portrayal cannot be overstated. Long before Shakespeare wrote, Sir Thomas More had already cast Richard as a ruthless usurper in his unfinished history. Polydore Virgil, writing under Henry VII, also painted him as cruel and tyrannical. These accounts provided Shakespeare with a ready-made villain, one whose reputation was already darkened by decades of hostile narrative. Shakespeare amplified these elements, combining history with theatrical imagination. The deformities described by More and others became more grotesque, the murders more calculating, the personality more fiendish. What in historical sources may have been ambiguous became in drama unambiguous evil. The contrast between historical Richard and literary Richard illustrates the power of narrative to shape memory. In historical record, Richard is a contested figure, his motives unclear, his actions debated, his culpability for the deaths of the princes uncertain. In literature, he is a masterpiece of villainy, a figure audiences love to hate. Drama simplifies and heightens. It does not aim for balance, but for impact. For centuries, this dramatic Richard overshadowed the historical one, leaving the general public with an image that owed more to Shakespeare's genius than to medieval fact. This difference between history and drama raises important questions. How far can one rely on literary depictions for understanding the past? When art and propaganda coincide, does truth vanish entirely, or can it still be glimpsed beneath exaggeration? In Richard's case, the literary image has been so powerful that even modern scholarship struggles against it. Productions of Shakespeare's play, films, and adaptations continue to present the hunchbacked schemer, and audiences rarely stop to consider whether this reflects historical reality. The fusion of Tudor propaganda and Shakespearean artistry created a portrait too vivid to erase. At the same time, the endurance of this image illustrates how history is not only recorded but performed. The narrative of Richard as villain satisfied the needs of the Tudors, the expectations of audiences, and the conventions of Elizabethan theater. It also offered timeless themes: the corrupting lure of power, the dangers of ambition, the triumph of justice over evil. In this sense, Richard transcends his historical moment to become a symbol, not merely a king of England, but a representation of villainy itself. That transformation from man to myth demonstrates how narratives shape memory, often more forcefully than evidence does. The debate over Richard III thus requires attention to both the chronicles and the stage. The Croyland Chronicle, Mancini's testimony, and Titulus Regius show a ruler navigating treacherous politics, sometimes ruthlessly, sometimes pragmatically. Shakespeare's play shows a theatrical villain whose evil is almost gleeful. Between these two versions lies the tension that fuels centuries of controversy. To study Richard is to study both history and literature, both evidence and myth. It is to recognize how deeply propaganda and entertainment intertwine, and how hard it is to separate the man who reigned briefly in the 15th century from the character who still struts across the stage. The shadow that has always darkened Richard III's reputation falls most heavily on the fate of his nephews, the two young princes who disappeared within the walls of the Tower of London. The story of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, has become the centerpiece of the argument that their uncle was a ruthless villain. When their father, Edward IV, died unexpectedly in the spring of 1483, the elder boy was only 12 years old, and his brother was 9. By the custom of the realm, Edward should have been crowned king, and his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector to guide the kingdom until the boy came of age. Yet within months, both children vanished from public view, never to be seen again. The circumstantial evidence pointing to Richard's involvement is powerful, though never conclusive. The boys were in his custody, housed in the Tower ostensibly for their safety in preparation for the coronation. Contemporary observers, including Dominic Mancini, wrote of rumors that the princes were held under close guard and that their status became increasingly uncertain. Soon afterward, Richard claimed the throne for himself, using the parliamentary act known as Titulus Regius to declare them illegitimate. Once he was crowned, the princes' continued existence posed a direct threat to his authority. They had a stronger hereditary claim than he did, and their survival offered a rallying point for opposition. The simplest explanation, therefore, is that Richard arranged their deaths. Later chroniclers, writing under Tudor influence, asserted as much with confidence, portraying him as the cold-blooded murderer of children. But while the suspicion lingers strongly, the case is far from airtight. No contemporary chronicler offers an eyewitness account of their deaths, and no body was ever found until two small skeletons were unearthed in the 17th century beneath a staircase in the tower, and even those remains cannot with certainty be identified as the prince's. Some historians suggest that Henry VII, who had equal motive to eliminate them once he became king, might have been responsible if they lived into his reign. Others propose that Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who rebelled against Richard in 1483, could have acted independently. The lack of definitive evidence means that Richard's role remains a matter of inference rather than proof. Still, to his critics, the disappearance of the princes represents the darkest crime of his reign, a mark of ruthless ambition that overshadows all else. The deaths or disappearance of the princes were not Richard's only suspected crimes. His treatment of rivals and allies alike revealed a willingness to use lethal force with startling swiftness. Perhaps the most shocking case was the execution of William Hastings, a loyal supporter of Edward IV who had helped secure Richard's position as protector. In June of 1483, during a council meeting at the Tower, Hastings was accused of treason, dragged out, and executed without trial. The speed of the act startled even contemporaries, suggesting that Richard saw Hastings as an obstacle to his plans for power and eliminated him in a moment of calculated ruthlessness. Others met similar fates. Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, along with his nephew Richard Grey and Thomas Vaughan, had been guardians of Edward V. They were arrested on Richard's orders as the young king was escorted to London and later executed at Pontefract. The justification offered was treason, but the swiftness of the process raised doubts about legality. These deaths conveniently removed the Woodvilles, the family of the Queen Dowager, who might have opposed Richard's claim. In this pattern of swift eliminations, critics see a man determined to clear his path to power at any cost, willing to sacrifice long-standing allies and innocent guardians alike. The legal cornerstone of Richard's usurpation lay in Titulus Regius, the Act of Parliament declaring Edward IV's marriage invalid and his children illegitimate. According to this argument, Edward had already been contracted to marry another woman, Eleanor Butler, before his union with Elizabeth Woodville. If true, then his marriage to Elizabeth was unlawful, and their offspring had no claim to the throne. This provided Richard with a cloak of legality for taking the crown himself. Yet the suspicion remains that the pre-contract was invented or exaggerated, a convenient legal fiction used to justify ambition. Even if it were true, the timing of its revelation raised doubts. Why did this information surface only after Edward's death, and only when Richard stood to gain by it? Critics argue that Titulus Regius was a cover for usurpation, the calculated seizure of the throne under the guise of defending lawful succession. What makes Richard's actions appear particularly villainous is not only the deeds themselves, but the manner in which they were carried out. The executions of Hastings and Rivers were conducted with extraordinary speed, leaving little room for defense or appeal. The prince's disappearance was shrouded in secrecy, with no public explanation. The usurpation was dressed in legal arguments, but bore the unmistakable mark of opportunism. To his enemies, and to many historians, this pattern reveals a man who cloaked ambition in legality while removing obstacles through ruthless violence. Beyond the specific acts attributed to him, Richard's personality and reputation contributed to his image as a villain. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe him as ambitious, manipulative, and calculating. Mancini, writing for his Italian patrons, observed that Richard was often regarded with suspicion and described his rise as the product of cunning. The narrative of cruelty was reinforced by Tudor chroniclers, who emphasized his alleged delight in bloodshed. Even among his allies, the swiftness with which he turned against former supporters sowed fear and distrust. His physical appearance became central to his reputation. Writers such as Thomas More described him as deformed, with a crooked back and withered arm, a body that supposedly mirrored his twisted soul. Shakespeare amplified this into the archetype of the hunchbacked villain, making his body a symbol of inner corruption. Modern science, through the examination of Richard's skeleton discovered in Leicester, shows that he suffered from scoliosis, which would have caused uneven shoulders, but not the monstrous deformity depicted in literature. Nevertheless, in his own time, and especially afterward, the physical narrative became a powerful tool for demonizing him. In an age when outward appearance was often thought to reflect inner virtue or vice, Richard's supposed deformity became a sign of his villainy. Foreign observers added to this dark reputation. Reports from Burgundy and other courts portrayed him as ruthless, though these accounts were often colored by political alliances. Mancini's account, while based largely on rumor, carried weight precisely because it was written by an outsider who had no stake in English internal politics. To foreign eyes, Richard's rapid seizure of power and the disappearance of the princes looked like unmistakable signs of tyranny. The long-term impact of Richard's rule reinforced the image of villainy. His reign was short, lasting just over 2 years, and it was marked by instability and rebellion. The Buckingham Rebellion in 1483 showed that his authority was contested from the outset. His inability to secure foreign alliances and the death of his only son left him politically vulnerable. His defeat at Bosworth in August 1485, where he died fighting bravely but without sufficient support, sealed his fate. Henry Tudor's victory was presented as the triumph of justice over tyranny, and Richard's body, stripped and humiliated, symbolized the downfall of a villainous usurper. In legacy, Richard was remembered less for his legal reforms or his patronage of the North than for the shadow of the princes and the brutality of his rise. He became, in the Tudor narrative, the final tyrant whose death brought peace. His memory was not rehabilitated until centuries later, and even then it has remained contested. To many, he is still the archetype of the failed and brutal monarch, a ruler whose ambition destroyed both himself and his dynasty. Thus, the case for Richard as a villain rests on 3 pillars: the probable murder of the princes, the ruthless elimination of rivals, and the usurpation of the throne under dubious legality. To this is added a reputation for cruelty, reinforced by physical descriptions and foreign testimony, and a legacy of instability culminating in violent downfall. These elements together create the portrait of Richard III as a man whose ambition outweighed morality, and whose reign was doomed by the very ruthlessness that brought him to power. The case against Richard III rests heavily on the assumption that he was guilty of ruthless ambition and calculated cruelty, but to many scholars and defenders he appears as much a victim as a villain. If one examines carefully the circumstances of his reign, the political necessities of the age, and the way his reputation was deliberately blackened by the Tudors, it becomes clear that the image of Richard as the archetypal tyrant owes more to propaganda and drama than to impartial history. The transformation of Richard into a byword for treachery and wickedness served a purpose. It justified the tenuous claim of Henry VII to the throne and ensured that the new dynasty began its reign with an aura of divine approval. To paint Richard as a villain was to make Henry appear the restorer of order, and in that contrast the Tudor monarchy secured legitimacy. Henry's claim by blood was weak, descending through a line that had been declared illegitimate generations before. His triumph at Bosworth was achieved through battle, not inheritance, and his right to rule needed support from narrative as much as from force. The easiest way to strengthen his claim was to portray Richard not simply as a defeated rival, but as a usurper and a murderer. By presenting his reign as one of tyranny, Henry could cast his own victory as liberation. Thus began the systematic destruction of Richard's reputation. One of Henry's first acts after securing power was to order the repeal and destruction of the Act of Parliament, known as Titulus Regius. This document, passed under Richard's authority, had declared Edward IV's marriage invalid and his children illegitimate. For Richard, it was the legal foundation of his title. For Henry, who married Edward's daughter Elizabeth to unite the houses of Lancaster and York, it was a dangerous reminder that his own queen might have been barred from legitimacy. The obliteration of Titulus Regius was both practical and symbolic. It erased the legal argument that had supported Richard's rule and removed from public record a justification that might complicate Tudor claims. That destruction itself is telling, for it shows that Richard's version of events was not allowed to stand. His voice was silenced, and the official story of his reign was written by his conquerors. Henry also encouraged the writing of histories that painted Richard in the darkest colors. Polydore Virgil, commissioned under Tudor patronage, depicted him as cruel and treacherous. Later, Thomas More composed his famous account, filled with dramatic detail and scathing judgments, though it remained unfinished. These works, widely circulated, shaped the collective memory of Richard long before Shakespeare dramatized him. More's history in particular presented Richard as a twisted schemer, a characterization that blended seamlessly into the theatrical villain of the Elizabethan stage. By the time Shakespeare wrote his play at the end of the 16th century, Richard's reputation had already been deeply stained, but Shakespeare's genius ensured it would remain indelible. Shakespeare's Richard is perhaps the most effective piece of Tudor propaganda ever created, though its brilliance lies in the fact that it transcends mere politics. He turned Richard into a figure of mesmerizing evil, a man who glories in deception, who delights in murder, and who seduces the audience with wit while committing unspeakable crimes. The deformity of body becomes the emblem of deformity of soul, and the fall of Richard provides a moral climax that justifies the rise of Henry Tudor. Even though Shakespeare was writing more than a century after Bosworth, his audience still lived under Tudor rule, and the play reinforced the legitimacy of the dynasty by showing the monstrous figure who had preceded it. The cultural impact of this portrayal has lasted through centuries. Generations who never read a chronicle or a legal document knew Richard only as Shakespeare's villain, and the image of the hunchbacked tyrant dominated popular imagination. When one strips away these layers of propaganda, the circumstances of Richard's reign appear less the story of a monstrous usurper and more the tragedy of a man caught in the turbulence of the Wars of the Roses. He came to power at a time when England had been torn apart by decades of civil conflict. Succession was uncertain, loyalty was fragile, and political survival often required ruthless choices. The Lancastrians had been crushed at Tewkesbury, but the threat of rebellion lingered. Noble families were divided, alliances unstable, and regional rivalries fierce. For Richard, every step after the death of his brother Edward was fraught with danger. As protector, he faced the power of the Woodville family, whose influence through the young king's mother threatened to dominate the government. His move against them, which included the arrest of Rivers and Grey, may be seen not as wanton cruelty, but as a preemptive strike in a brutal political contest. The execution of Hastings, shocking though it appeared, might also be read as an act of survival. Hastings was close to the Woodvilles and may have opposed Richard's bid for control. In an age when hesitation could mean ruin, Richard acted decisively. His seizure of the throne, justified by the claim of illegitimacy against Edward's children, may have been ambitious, but it was also rooted in genuine political anxiety. If the Woodvilles had ruled in Edward V's name, Richard's position and perhaps his life could have been at risk. What appears as usurpation in hindsight might have seemed necessity to Richard himself. The disappearance of the princes remains the most difficult matter. Yet here, too, ambiguity persists. That they were a threat to Richard's security is undeniable, but their actual fate is uncertain. Some historians argue that they may have died of natural causes or been quietly disposed of by others. Buckingham, who rose against Richard, had both motive and opportunity. Later, Henry VII had equal motive, since their survival would have undermined his rule. The lack of direct evidence leaves open the possibility that Richard has been blamed for a crime he did not commit, his guilt assumed largely because it suited his enemies to believe it. Beyond questions of ambition and crime, Richard's reign reveals achievements often overlooked. Despite ruling for just over 2 years, he implemented legal reforms that suggest a concern for justice and fairness. He introduced measures to protect ordinary people against the corruption of officials, attempted to make bail more accessible, and sought to prevent the seizure of property without due process. These initiatives suggest not a tyrant, but a king aware of the grievances of his subjects, especially those of lesser means. In the north of England, where he had long served as his brother's lieutenant, Richard was remembered with loyalty for his fairness and generosity. He also patronized learning and culture, continuing the tradition of noble support for education and the arts. These positive aspects of his reign seldom appear in the popular imagination, overshadowed by the drama of the princes and the villainy of Shakespeare, but they form part of the historical record. Richard's humanity emerges further when one considers the personal tragedies he endured. The death of his only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, in 1484 left him bereft of an heir, undermining his dynastic security. His wife and Neville also died during his reign, and rumors swirled, almost certainly false, that he poisoned her to pursue a more advantageous marriage. These losses cast a shadow over his short tenure, leaving him isolated in both personal and political terms. A man so embattled might easily be painted as desperate, but he was also deeply unlucky, struck by events that would have destabilized even the most secure monarch. The misrepresentation of Richard's physical appearance has been one of the most enduring elements of his vilification. The discovery of his skeleton in Leicester in 2012 confirmed that he suffered from scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that would have made one shoulder higher than the other. Yet this condition, while noticeable, would not have rendered him grotesque or incapable of martial activity. Indeed, evidence from the skeleton shows he fought bravely at Bosworth, sustaining numerous wounds before being overwhelmed. The monstrous hunchback of Shakespeare and more was a distortion, designed to make his body a metaphor for evil. In an age when physical deformity was often linked to moral corruption, exaggerating Richard's condition provided a powerful rhetorical tool. The Real Richard was no monstrous cripple, but a capable warrior and commander who led men in battle. The contrast between the historical skeleton and the literary caricature highlights the extent of the misrepresentation. For centuries, portraits and performances showed Richard with a twisted body, an outward sign of inward wickedness. Only modern science has revealed the truth, that he was physically imperfect, but far from the grotesque figure described by his enemies. This misrepresentation underscores the degree to which Richard was a victim, not just of political defeat, but of a cultural campaign to demonize him. His bones tell a story different from the stage, one of a man who bore a physical condition with resilience rather than one whose body reflected evil. Taken together, these considerations present Richard not as the villain of Tudor narrative, but as a man trapped by circumstance, vilified by enemies, and remembered through distortion. His reign occurred in the midst of one of the most unstable periods in English history, when survival often required ruthless choices. His enemies had every reason to tarnish his memory, and the most brilliant playwright of the English language fixed that tarnished image in enduring form. Yet beneath the propaganda and the drama lies evidence of a ruler concerned with justice, loyal to his brother, and capable of effective governance. His actions, often judged as crimes, can also be seen as responses to extraordinary threats. His supposed deformity, used as a symbol of evil, was in truth a manageable condition exaggerated beyond recognition. Richard III may well have been ambitious, and he may have committed acts that to modern sensibilities appear cruel. But he was also the victim of forces greater than himself. The brutal politics of the Wars of the Roses, the necessity of legitimizing a new dynasty, and the power of literature to cement reputation. To view him solely as villain is to accept the version handed down by his conquerors. To see him as victim is to recognize how history is shaped not only by deeds, but by the stories told afterward. In the end, Richard was both a man of his time, capable of ruthlessness, but also the target of one of the most successful smear campaigns in history, remembered less for what he truly was than for what his enemies needed him to be. The heart of the debate over Richard III's reputation lies in the fate of the princes in the Tower, an issue that has overshadowed every other aspect of his reign. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, has become one of the most famous mysteries in English history, and it is the question that most strongly divides those who view Richard as villain from those who see him as victim. To some, the silence of the sources, the sudden removal of the boys from public view, and the political convenience of their disappearance form strong circumstantial evidence against Richard. To others, the absence of proof, the political advantages gained by other parties, and the sheer complexity of the situation suggest that his guilt is not established and may in fact be the product of later Tudor propaganda. To explore this controversy properly, one must consider both the case for Richard's guilt and the case for his innocence, while also tracing how historians over the centuries have approached the mystery. At first glance, Richard's motive seems obvious. As protector and later as king, he was responsible for the boys' safety. Their existence was the chief obstacle to his secure rule. For so long as Edward V lived, Richard's claim could be contested. His title rested on the argument that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, making her children illegitimate. Yet the force of bloodline, the memory of Edward IV's reign, and the loyalty he had inspired among many subjects made his son a dangerous rallying point. Removing Edward V and his brother from the line of succession would, in theory, end that danger. In this light, Richard had both the motive and the opportunity to arrange their deaths. They were lodged in the Tower of London, under his control, and their disappearance occurred after he assumed the throne. From a strictly political standpoint, Richard stood to gain most from their absence. The chroniclers closest to the time lend some weight to this interpretation. Dominic Mancini, an Italian visitor to England, recorded that the boys were seen less and less in public, and that people feared they had been murdered. The Croyland Chronicle, composed by a cleric not entirely friendly to Richard, also hinted at suspicion surrounding the matter. Neither account offers direct proof, but they suggest that contemporaries associated the disappearance with Richard's consolidation of power. Later writers, especially Thomas More, expanded these suspicions into detailed narratives of murder. More's unfinished account describes the princes smothered in their beds by agents acting under Richard's orders, a tale that, though written decades later, became the foundation for Shakespeare's harrowing scenes in his play. Yet the case is far from settled, for the evidence against Richard remains circumstantial. No eyewitness testimony exists, no bodies were produced at the time, and no official announcement of their deaths was made. In fact, one could argue that Richard's position might have been stronger had the princes lived openly under his custody. As king, he could have presented himself as their protector, keeping them safe while governing in their name or alongside them. Their quiet removal, without explanation, created rumors that undermined rather than strengthened his authority. If Richard had indeed murdered them, it was a political miscalculation, for the whispers of the crime eroded support and fueled rebellion. It is also worth noting that Richard was not the only figure who might have benefited from the prince's disappearance. Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, had as much reason as Richard to wish them gone. His own claim to the throne was weak, descending through the illegitimate Beaufort line, and it gained credibility only if Edward V and his brother were removed from the equation. When Henry seized power after Bosworth, he married Elizabeth of York, sister of the princes, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York. This marriage was a masterstroke of politics, but it would have been imperiled if Edward V or his brother had still been alive. In fact, Henry acted swiftly to suppress any alternative claimants, as seen in his treatment of the pretenders Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, both of whom gained followers by claiming connection to the lost princes. If the boys had survived into Henry's reign, they would have been natural figureheads for rebellion. Thus Henry had a strong incentive to eliminate them once he secured power. Another possible suspect is the Duke of Buckingham. Initially Richard's ally, Buckingham soon rebelled against him, perhaps disappointed in the rewards he received or perhaps seeing an opportunity to seize the throne himself. Some historians suggest that Buckingham, ambitious and well-positioned, might have arranged the princes' deaths, either with or without Richard's knowledge. His rebellion indicates that he had turned against Richard quickly, and in such a climate of shifting loyalties, it is not implausible that he acted independently. Buckingham's later execution prevented him from defending himself or clarifying his role, leaving his possible involvement forever uncertain. The enduring mystery lies in the absence of decisive evidence. The bones discovered in the Tower in 1674, believed by some to be those of the princes, were never conclusively identified. They were interred in Westminster Abbey, but modern analysis has not yet been permitted. Without forensic confirmation, the identity of the remains remains speculative. This uncertainty has allowed debate to flourish. Each generation of historians re-examines the question, weighing the limited evidence against the broader context of political necessity and propaganda. In the centuries following Richard's fall, Tudor accounts dominated. The image of Richard as child murderer became fixed in the public mind, reinforced by literature, drama, and repetition. Shakespeare's powerful portrayal left no room for doubt in the popular imagination. To Elizabethan audiences, the smothering of the princes was both a dramatic climax and a moral lesson. Yet modern historians have approached the issue with greater caution. Revisionist scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries questioned whether Richard was truly guilty, pointing out that much of the evidence came from Tudor sources with every reason to vilify him. Some suggested that the boys may have survived longer than assumed, perhaps even into Henry VII's reign, and that their disappearance was more convenient for Henry than for Richard. Others argued that the lack of public announcement by Richard and the political damage caused by rumors of their deaths made little sense if he had indeed ordered the murders. Still, the case against Richard remains compelling to many. The fact that the boys vanished while in his custody, and that no credible alternative explanation has emerged, makes it difficult to absolve him entirely. Historians who view him as guilty argue that Richard was a seasoned political operator, aware that the presence of rival claimants could destabilize his rule. They contend that his apparent lack of success in quelling rumors might simply reflect the risk he accepted when making a ruthless but necessary decision. To these scholars, Richard's guilt fits the pattern of ambition and cruelty that characterized his reign. The debate has thus oscillated between these two poles. On the one hand, Richard as the calculating uncle who removed his nephews to secure the throne. On the other, Richard as the scapegoat of Tudor propaganda, unfairly blamed for a crime that others had motive and opportunity to commit. What complicates the matter further is the way historical interpretation reflects contemporary values. In the Victorian era, with its fascination for moral character, Richard was sometimes defended as a man of principle wronged by slander. In the modern era, with its focus on context and power politics, scholars emphasize the brutality of the age, suggesting that whether or not Richard ordered the deaths, he was operating in a world where such acts were far from unthinkable. What remains striking is the endurance of the question itself. More than 5 centuries after the events, the fate of the princes continues to fascinate precisely because it cannot be resolved. The absence of definitive proof keeps the debate alive, and each generation reinterprets the evidence in light of its own concerns. For Richard's defenders, the mystery is emblematic of how victors write history, turning a defeated rival into a monster. For his detractors, it is the central piece of evidence that justifies his reputation as one of England's most notorious kings. The controversy over the princes in the Tower therefore serves as the axis around which the debate over Richard's character turns. Without this mystery, his reign might be remembered as short, troubled, but not uniquely infamous. With it, he becomes either the archetypal villain or the classic victim of historical injustice. The persistence of the debate highlights the complexity of historical truth. It is not merely a matter of uncovering facts, but of interpreting fragments, weighing motives, and acknowledging the influence of narrative. In Richard's case, the truth may never be known, but the search for it continues to shape how we understand the man, his reign, and the nature of history itself. In considering the enigma of the princes in the Tower, it becomes clear that the question of Richard III's character and reign cannot be settled by evidence alone. It is bound up in the stories told about him, the ways in which each age has chosen to interpret the scraps of testimony that survive, and the powerful influence of literature, drama, and politics. From the very beginning, Richard's reputation was shaped less by what he indisputably did than by how later chroniclers, dramatists, and historians chose to frame his actions. To understand Richard fully, one must follow the course of his reputation through the centuries, tracing how each generation has either darkened or softened his image. Modern historiography reveals as much about the anxieties and values of later ages as it does about the 15th century king himself. The earliest accounts of Richard came from Tudor chroniclers writing under the patronage or within the shadow of Henry VII and Henry VIII. Polydore Virgil, the Italian humanist commissioned to write the official history of England, offered one of the first systematic portrayals of Richard. In his narrative, Richard was unscrupulous, cruel, and calculating. Virgil depicted him as responsible for the deaths of his nephews, and as the archetype of a tyrant whose downfall at Bosworth was providential. This version of events suited the Tudor regime perfectly. By presenting Richard as a usurper who committed heinous crimes, Virgil justified Henry VII's seizure of power and gave his dynasty a moral legitimacy it otherwise lacked. Thomas More, writing in the early 16th century, crafted an even more enduring portrait. His unfinished history of King Richard III is one of the most influential works in shaping Richard's posthumous reputation. More's account is filled with vivid detail and dramatic scenes, portraying Richard as a deceitful hunchback, delighting in manipulation and murder. The narrative, though never completed, painted a picture of villainy so compelling that it became the foundation for later dramatizations. While scholars debate how much of More's account was factual and how much was moral allegory or even satire, its impact on Richard's image cannot be overstated. It fixed in the English imagination the notion of Richard as a man both physically and morally twisted, whose ambition drove him to kill his young nephews. Edward Hall's Chronicle, published in the mid-16th century, built on these earlier accounts and transmitted them to the Elizabethan world. Hall's union of the two noble and illustrious families of Lancaster and York combined narrative history with patriotic moralizing, presenting Richard as the final tyrant whose fall brought peace under the Tudors. This version, in turn, became one of the key sources for William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Richard III transformed the chronicler's accounts into high drama. Written during the reign of Elizabeth, the granddaughter of Henry VII, The play turned Richard into one of the most captivating villains in English literature. Shakespeare combined historical rumor with theatrical invention, making Richard a master of soliloquy, a manipulator who speaks directly to the audience, delighting in his own schemes. The crooked back, the withered arm, the malicious smile, all became symbols of evil incarnate. While Shakespeare was writing more than 100 years after Richard's death, and while his purpose was entertainment as much as history, his play entrenched an image that has proven stronger than any archive or excavation. For centuries, the public knew Richard not from chronicles or state papers, but from the stage, where he was always the murderous hunchback whose crimes were punished by divine justice at Bosworth. The power of drama to shape memory meant that Richard's reputation became inseparable from Shakespeare's villain. It was not until the 18th century that the first serious revisionist voices emerged. Horace Walpole, in his historic doubts on the life and reign of King Richard III, challenged the traditional narrative. Writing in the Age of Enlightenment, Walpole applied a more skeptical eye to the Tudor sources, questioning their bias and pointing out the absence of hard evidence for Richard's supposed crimes. Walpole did not necessarily exonerate Richard, but he highlighted the inconsistencies and contradictions in the accepted story. His work represented an important turning point, for it suggested that Richard might have been more sinned against than sinning, and it encouraged later scholars to reconsider the evidence without simply accepting Tudor propaganda as truth. The 19th century saw the growth of this revisionist tendency. Victorian historians, influenced by romantic ideals and a fascination with character, often sought to rescue Richard from his dark reputation. Writers emphasized his loyalty to his brother Edward IV, his administrative reforms, and his popularity in the north of England. The rise of historical societies and a new interest in archival research led to more systematic efforts to reassess his reign. Richard began to appear as a tragic figure, unlucky in politics and maligned by history, rather than as an outright monster. In the 20th century, Richard's defenders gained further strength through the work of scholars like Paul Murray Kendall. His biography, published in the mid-20th century, offered a sympathetic portrait that stressed Richard's humanity, his genuine attempts at reform, and the distortions imposed by later generations. Kendall acknowledged the uncertainty around the princes in the Tower, but argued that the case against Richard was far from conclusive. His work, widely read, influenced public perception by offering an alternative to the Shakespearean stereotype. It also coincided with the growth of the Richard III Society, founded in the 1920s, which aimed to promote research into Richard's life and to counter what its members saw as centuries of unfair vilification. The Richard III Society became a focal point for modern defenders of the king. Through publications, conferences, and educational outreach, its members argued that Richard was a competent ruler whose short reign showed promise, and that his reputation had been irreparably damaged by Tudor propaganda. The society fostered a community of amateur and professional historians united by the belief that Richard deserved a fair hearing. While mainstream scholarship often remained cautious, the society kept alive the revisionist spirit begun by Walpole and carried forward by Kendall. The most dramatic development in modern Richardian historiography came in the 21st century with the rediscovery of his remains in 2012. Excavations in a Leicester car park, conducted by archaeologists in collaboration with the Richard III Society, uncovered a skeleton later confirmed through DNA testing to be that of Richard. The discovery captured worldwide attention, bringing Richard back into public debate in a way no historical argument alone could have done. The skeleton provided remarkable new evidence. It confirmed that Richard suffered from scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, which would have made one shoulder higher than the other, but would not have rendered him deformed in the grotesque way Shakespeare and Moore had described. Far from being a monstrous cripple, Richard would have appeared slender and slightly uneven in stature, but still capable of fighting as a soldier. Indeed, analysis of the bones revealed that he had sustained numerous wounds at Bosworth, suggesting that he fought bravely on the battlefield before being overwhelmed. Far from a cowardly tyrant, Richard died as a warrior king. The archaeological findings also offered insight into his death. The injuries on his skull and body suggested multiple attackers, consistent with an account of him being surrounded and killed after losing his horse. The violence of his end was brutal, reflecting both the chaos of battle and the desire of his enemies to humiliate him. For supporters, the discovery of his skeleton humanized Richard, stripping away the layers of myth and propaganda and revealing the man beneath. The reburial of Richard in Leicester Cathedral in 2015 became a public event, attracting vast attention and renewed debate. Was Richard a murderer whose remains were receiving undue honor, or was he a maligned king finally given dignity? The ceremonies reflected how deeply Richard's reputation continues to divide opinion, even centuries after his death. The rediscovery of Richard's remains reignited the broader historiographical debate. Some historians used the findings to argue that the myths about Richard's deformity had been exaggerated to serve Tudor propaganda. Others stressed that the new evidence did not resolve the question of the princes in the Tower, leaving the central controversy untouched. Yet the sheer visibility of the discovery, amplified by media coverage, brought Richard back into public consciousness in a way not seen for generations. Plays, documentaries, and books once again revisited his life, his reign, and the enduring mystery of his reputation. Modern historiography of Richard III is thus characterized by a dialogue between two powerful traditions. On one side stands the Shakespearean image of the villain, born from Tudor chroniclers and cemented by literature. On the other stands the revisionist and Ricardian defense, emphasizing evidence of fairness, reform, and the unreliability of Tudor accounts. The rediscovery of his skeleton has strengthened the latter, offering tangible proof against the caricature of physical monstrosity, but it has not silenced the former, for the power of Shakespeare's drama remains immense. What is perhaps most striking about modern debate is not that it has resolved the question of Richard's character, but that it has made him one of the most studied and contested figures in English history. Few kings who reigned for so short a time have inspired so much passion. Richard has become a test case for how history is written, how propaganda shapes memory, and how literature can overshadow fact. Each new discovery, each reinterpretation, each performance of Shakespeare's play contributes to the evolving picture of a man who remains elusive. In this way, the historiography of Richard III tells us as much about the ages that studied him as it does about the 15th century. The Tudors needed a villain to justify their dynasty, and so they gave the world a monster. The Enlightenment sought reason and skepticism, and so Walpole raised doubts. The Victorians searched for moral character and tragedy, and so they softened Richard's image. The 20th century, fascinated by psychology and political context, produced sympathetic biographies and scholarly societies. The 21st century, with its interest in science and media spectacle, uncovered his body and reignited debate. Richard has been endlessly remade to suit the needs and values of later generations. And so the story of Richard III remains unfinished. The mystery of the princes endures, the influence of Shakespeare continues, and the findings of archaeology add new layers without closing the case. He is both villain and victim, both historical king and literary construct, both man of reform and alleged murderer. Modern historiography reveals not a final judgment, but a continuing conversation, one that ensures Richard will remain a figure of fascination for centuries to come. The rediscovery of Richard's remains in Leicester, and the flood of debate that followed made clear what had long been evident: that Richard III cannot be fully understood within the confines of a single narrative. He has lived for centuries both as a villain and as a victim, sometimes simultaneously, his image shifting according to the priorities of those telling his story. The controversy endures precisely because it cannot be settled by one explanation. To many, he is a ruthless usurper whose ambition drove him to eliminate rivals, even innocent nephews. To others, he is a man who rose in the midst of civil war, doing what countless nobles of his age did, yet singled out by history for vilification because he lost. In grappling with these dual perspectives, we find not only a portrait of Richard himself, but also a reflection of how historical memory works, how it demonizes some and redeems others. To understand Richard as both villain and victim, one must first place him within the brutal environment of the Wars of the Roses. This was not a time of gentle politics or stable succession, but of shifting loyalties, sudden reversals, and relentless bloodshed. Since the deposition of Richard II in the late 14th century, England had struggled with the problem of dynastic legitimacy. Weak claims to the throne, rival houses with overlapping genealogies, and the personal failings of monarchs created a climate in which violence became the arbiter of power. The 15th century was marked by battles such as Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury, each producing heavy casualties among nobles and common soldiers alike. In such a world, ruthlessness was not exceptional. It was the currency of survival. Richard grew up in this environment. He was only a child when his father, the Duke of York, was killed in battle, his head displayed on the gates of York with a mocking paper crown. He spent his formative years amid the constant threat of exile, defeat, or sudden reversal. His elder brother Edward fought his way to the throne through both victory and luck, holding it only because he was more ruthless and militarily capable than Henry VI and his allies. Richard learned early that power was precarious and that hesitation could be fatal. To expect him to behave with the restraint of a later constitutional monarch is to misunderstand the world he inhabited. When judged against the standards of his time, Richard's actions appear less monstrous. The execution of political rivals without formal trials, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was not uncommon in the 15th century. Edward IV himself ordered the death of his brother Clarence, drowning him in a butt of Malmsey wine after a hasty trial. Henry V had executed the conspirators at Southampton before departing for Agincourt. Even Henry VII, often cast as the bringer of order, pursued rebels with severity, executing potential rivals and using acts of attainder to strip enemies of wealth. In this context, Richard's removal of Hastings or his maneuvering against the Woodvilles can be seen as the rough justice of an age where political survival demanded decisive, even brutal measures. The disappearance of the princes remains the darkest stain on his reputation, but here too the brutal logic of the age must be considered. Children had not always been spared in dynastic struggles. The fate of young Edward of Lancaster, killed after Tewkesbury, or the imprisonment of Eleanor de Clare's descendants in earlier reigns showed that innocence was no shield when dynastic legitimacy was at stake. If Richard did order the deaths of his nephews, he acted in line with a cruel but not unprecedented pattern. If he did not, then he has been made the scapegoat for an act that any claimant, including Henry VII, might have committed in order to secure the throne. Either way, the question of villainy cannot be separated from the harsh realities of civil war politics. This raises the question of whether Richard was driven more by ambition or by survival. His seizure of the throne has been cast as the ultimate act of opportunism, yet it can also be read as a defensive measure. As protector, he faced the dominance of the Woodvilles, who sought to control government through their kinship with the young king. Their influence threatened not only Richard's power, but possibly his safety, given the blood feuds and rivalries of the time. By claiming that Edward's children were illegitimate, Richard gave a legal veneer to his assumption of the crown, but it may also have been his only viable path to protect himself and his faction. In this light, ambition and survival blur into one another, making it difficult to draw a clear line between the two. The distinction between reputation and reality becomes especially significant in Richard's case. His actual policies, such as reforms to improve access to bail, efforts to curb corruption in the courts, and protections against property seizure, suggest a concern for fairness and good governance. These measures were remembered fondly in the North, where Richard had long been a respected lord. His patronage of learning and culture further complicates the image of a man supposedly consumed by cruelty. Yet these achievements were overshadowed almost immediately by the narrative crafted by his conquerors. Reputation, once established, proved more powerful than policy. The figure of the murderous usurper overwhelmed the memory of the reforming king. It is here that the duality of villain and victim becomes clearest. Richard was certainly a man capable of ruthless action. His choices contributed to his downfall, and his reign was marked by bloodshed and suspicion. Yet he was also a victim of circumstance, of political necessity, of dynastic rivalry, and above all of historical memory. The Tudor dynasty had every reason to demonize him, and the greatest dramatist of the English language ensured that this demonization would endure. Richard's true self, the man revealed by his skeleton and the records of his policies, was buried beneath centuries of propaganda and theater. The process by which historical memory either demonizes or redeems is itself instructive. Other rulers, equally ruthless, have been remembered more favorably because their dynasties endured. Edward IV, who executed his own brother and manipulated succession for his benefit, is remembered as a successful and charismatic monarch. Henry VII, who eliminated rivals and ruled with a cold pragmatism, is celebrated as the founder of a lasting dynasty. By contrast, Richard lost at Bosworth, and in losing, he lost control of the narrative. The victors wrote history, and the defeated was cast as villain. In this sense, Richard's story demonstrates how memory is less about deeds than about outcomes. Those who succeed are remembered as statesmen, Those who fail are remembered as tyrants. Modern debates about Richard reveal a continuing struggle between these two perspectives. On one hand, Shakespeare's villain endures, performed on stages worldwide, taught in schools, and embedded in cultural imagination. On the other hand, revisionist historians and the Richard III Society continue to emphasize his reforms, his loyalty to his brother, and the distortions of Tudor propaganda. The rediscovery of his remains has tilted the balance slightly toward a more sympathetic view, undermining the caricature of a monstrous hunchback and highlighting his courage in death. Yet the absence of definitive answers about the princes keeps the villain narrative alive. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that Richard was both villain and victim, depending on the lens through which he is viewed. He was a man of his times, shaped by the violence of the Wars of the Roses, acting with ambition and ruthlessness when necessary, but also striving for effective governance. His villainy lies in the ruthless acts he may have committed. His victimhood lies in the way those acts were exaggerated, distorted, and enshrined in cultural memory. The duality is not a contradiction, but a truth of history. Men can be both perpetrators and sufferers, both agents of cruelty and targets of propaganda. In Richard's story, we see the fine line between ambition and survival, between villainy and necessity, between reality and reputation. We also see the enduring power of narrative to shape historical memory, demonizing some figures and redeeming others. Richard remains a man caught between these poles, his life and reign a mirror reflecting the brutal age in which he lived and the centuries of interpretation that followed. The continuing fascination with him lies not in resolving the question once and for all, but in acknowledging that the truth of Richard III exists somewhere in the tension between villain and victim, a tension that ensures his story will never lose its power to provoke debate. The difficulty of separating Richard III's real actions from the stories told about him becomes even clearer when he is set alongside other rulers who have been branded villains in history, literature, or both. Some monarchs and leaders became infamous because of cruelty that was undeniable, while others were remembered as evil primarily because their enemies controlled the narratives of their lives. Richard belongs to this second group in part, but not wholly, since his own decisions contributed to his reputation. Comparing him with figures such as King John, Macbeth, and the Roman Emperor Nero shows how villainy is often less about what a ruler actually did than about how later generations chose to remember those deeds. At the same time, looking at other men who suffered from propaganda makes it clear that Richard was not alone in being reshaped by historical memory. His story, like theirs, illustrates how power, failure, and survival influence legacy. King John is perhaps the closest English parallel to Richard when it comes to a king remembered as a villain. John ruled in the early 13th century and is known to most people not for the complexities of his reign, but as the cowardly and cruel antagonist of the Robin Hood legends. Yet if we look at the historical record, the story is more complicated. John certainly lost the support of many of his barons, he failed to hold on to Normandy, and his conflicts with the church weakened his authority. His cruelty in the treatment of hostages and political enemies is also well documented. But the image of John as a thoroughly wicked monarch was intensified by the baronial rebellion that produced Magna Carta and by chroniclers sympathetic to the rebels. Later, writers and storytellers, especially those who developed the Robin Hood cycle, turned him into a pantomime villain, a foil for the noble outlaw and the absent King Richard the Lionheart. Thus, while John did act ruthlessly and lost legitimacy, the enduring image of him as a treacherous tyrant is as much the product of centuries of storytelling as it is of his own actions. In this sense, Richard III and John share a similar fate. They both ruled in unstable times, committed acts that were not unusual for rulers of their age, but were remembered primarily for their failings because history was written by them. Macbeth provides another revealing comparison, though he belongs to both history and literature. The historical Macbeth was an 11th century Scottish king who came to power after killing Duncan in battle. Sources suggest that his reign was not lawless or cruel. In fact, some records describe it as relatively stable, and he even made a pilgrimage to Rome. Yet the Macbeth most people know is Shakespeare's murderous usurper, driven by ambition, goaded by his wife, and haunted by guilt. The play was written centuries after the real Macbeth's life, and was influenced by the political climate of Shakespeare's own time, particularly the desire to flatter King James I, who traced his lineage back to Banquo, a figure presented as noble in the play. Macbeth, then, was transformed into a symbol of tyranny ambition, and supernatural evil, bearing little resemblance to the historical king. Richard III underwent a similar transformation. His historical reign was marked by complexity, but Shakespeare turned him into an embodiment of villainy to serve political and theatrical purposes. Both Macbeth and Richard show how literature can reshape reality, fixing in the public mind a version of a ruler that overwhelms the historical truth. The Roman Emperor Nero provides an even broader example of how a leader's memory can be blackened. Nero ruled in the 1st century, and ancient sources describe him as cruel, decadent, and destructive. He is said to have murdered his mother Agrippina, executed his rivals, and persecuted Christians. He is also infamous for supposedly playing the lyre while Rome burned, though this story is almost certainly false. Much of what we know about Nero comes from writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, who were hostile to him and wrote with hindsight after his fall. Nero certainly committed acts of cruelty, but the portrait of him as the embodiment of evil was shaped by political hostility and the desire of later emperors to contrast themselves with a discredited predecessor. Here again, we see the pattern that also applied to Richard. Once a ruler was overthrown or disgraced, subsequent generations had every reason to emphasize his villainy. Just as the Tudors needed Richard to appear monstrous, so later Roman emperors and historians had every reason to depict Nero as a warning example of what a ruler should not be. In all these cases, John, Macbeth, and Nero, the role of narrative has been decisive. Villainy becomes cemented not simply through the actions of the ruler, but through the stories told afterward. Chroniclers, playwrights, and historians, each writing with particular agendas, select and emphasize certain aspects while ignoring others. Richard was not unique in this regard, though his case is distinctive because Shakespeare's influence was so great that his image as a hunchbacked tyrant outlived even serious historical revision. But the mechanism is the same. Failure in politics or war opens the door to hostile stories, and hostile stories become the dominant memory. Richard also fits into a wider category of rulers who became victims of propaganda. Consider Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France during the Revolution. Her reputation as frivolous, extravagant, and cruel was largely the product of pamphlets and caricatures circulated by her enemies. The famous phrase, "let them eat cake," though she never said it, was enough to cement her as a symbol of aristocratic indifference. Or take Cleopatra of Egypt, remembered by Roman writers as a manipulative seductress, when in reality she was a capable political leader trying to defend her dynasty's survival against Rome's overwhelming power. Both women were remembered through hostile lenses created by their enemies, just as Richard was reshaped by Tudor chroniclers and dramatists. Even in English history, we see examples of rulers whose reputations were shaped more by narrative than by deeds. Mary I, called Bloody Mary, earned her epithet not solely because of the persecution of Protestants, but because Protestant writers like John Foxe enshrined her in texts that portrayed her reign as a cautionary tale. By contrast, her half-sister Elizabeth, who also executed religious opponents and pursued ruthless policies, was celebrated as Good Queen Bess, because she ruled successfully and left a lasting dynasty. The same pattern appears again. Success softens reputations, while failure magnifies villainy. Richard fell at Bosworth, and in falling, he surrendered control of how his life would be remembered. What these comparisons reveal is that the line between villain and victim in history is often determined less by actions than by outcomes and narratives. John, Macbeth, Nero, and Richard all had flaws and committed acts of ruthlessness. Yet their enduring reputations as villains stem from the fact that they were defeated or overthrown, and that their enemies told their stories. Propaganda, literature, and cultural memory turned them into archetypes of tyranny. At the same time, figures like Marie Antoinette or Cleopatra remind us that one can be vilified even when one's actual deeds were not especially villainous, simply because the victors or rivals needed a scapegoat. Richard stands at the intersection of these patterns. He was undoubtedly capable of cruelty, and the disappearance of the princes will always darken his legacy. But his villainy was cemented not just by what he did, but by the way others framed his actions. The comparison with John shows how political failure can fix a negative reputation. The comparison with Macbeth shows how literature can create a version of a ruler that eclipses history. The comparison with Nero shows how ancient and modern alike, rulers are remembered through hostile accounts. And the examples of Marie Antoinette, Cleopatra, and Mary I show that propaganda often leaves a deeper imprint than reality. Ultimately, Richard's story is part of a larger truth about history. Reputations are not fixed by deeds alone, but by who gets to tell the story afterward. Villainy and victimhood are both constructed in the process of remembering. Richard III was both a man of ruthless action and a man trapped in the narratives of others. His place alongside John, Macbeth, and Nero demonstrates how fragile legacy can be, how dependent it is on power, survival, and storytelling. To study Richard in this wider context is to see not only his own tragedy, but also the broader human pattern of rulers turned into villains by the pens of their enemies, the needs of dynasties, and the imaginations of poets. The question of whether Richard III should be remembered as a villain or a victim has occupied historians, writers, and the public imagination for more than 5 centuries. It is a debate that refuses to settle into a single answer because the evidence itself is contradictory, incomplete, and mediated through the hands of those with vested interests. Yet precisely because of this uncertainty, the debate continues to be meaningful. Richard is not only a historical figure, but also a symbol of how power, failure, and propaganda interact to shape legacy. To conclude this study, it is important to return to the central debate and weigh the arguments with a sense of balance, acknowledging that the truth lies neither wholly in condemnation nor entirely in rehabilitation. The villain narrative has powerful foundations. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower remains the central accusation that casts Richard as a ruthless usurper willing to kill children in order to secure his crown. As the boys' protector and the man who benefited most from their removal, Richard had both motive and opportunity. No other explanation has ever achieved the same level of plausibility, and even though alternative suspects such as Henry VII or the Duke of Buckingham have been suggested, the suspicion surrounding Richard has never been erased. In addition, Richard's swift execution of political rivals such as Lord Hastings, combined with his rapid move to have his nephews declared illegitimate through Titulus Regius, gave his actions the appearance of cold ambition. To his enemies and later to the Tudor dynasty, Richard embodied the dangers of unchecked power, a man willing to tear apart both family and kingdom to place a crown on his head. There is also the fact that Richard's reign ended in disaster. His hold on the throne was brief and unstable, collapsing at Bosworth in the face of Henry Tudor's challenge. In politics, outcomes often determine legacy, and Richard's defeat marked him as a failed monarch. A successful reign might have softened or justified some of his ruthlessness, but the brevity of his rule and the finality of his death in battle froze him in the role of tyrant. From this perspective, Richard appears as a villain not only in his alleged crimes, but also in the consequences of his reign, which opened the way for a new dynasty and left behind the perception of instability and brutality. Yet to leave the matter, there would be to accept too readily the stories told by his enemies. The victim narrative has gained strength particularly in the last century, and for good reason. Richard was the last Plantagenet king, and his defeat at Bosworth made it imperative for Henry VII to justify his victory by portraying Richard as monstrous. Tudor chroniclers, most famously Thomas More and Polydore Vergil, painted Richard as deformed in both body and soul, a usurper who murdered his nephews, betrayed his allies, and brought chaos to England. This was not impartial history but political necessity. Shakespeare's play, written during the reign of Elizabeth I, cemented this image on the stage, creating the archetype of the hunchbacked villain whose physical deformity symbolized inner evil. For centuries, this theatrical version defined Richard in the public mind, overshadowing any nuance or complexity. Modern scholarship, archaeology, and the rediscovery of Richard's remains in Leicester have complicated this picture. The skeleton revealed that Richard suffered from scoliosis, but was not the grotesque hunchback of Shakespeare's imagination. His remains also showed evidence of his courage in battle, facing his enemies directly rather than fleeing the field. Contemporary records of his policies highlight legal reforms that sought to protect the poor from corruption, to regulate bail more fairly, and to restrain abuses by local officials. In the north of England, he was remembered fondly as a fair and generous lord. These aspects suggest a king who, far from being wholly villainous, had qualities of justice and good governance. The disappearance of the princes, while central, is not conclusive. No definitive proof links Richard to their deaths. The boys may have died during his reign, but they may also have lived into the reign of Henry VII, only to be silenced later when their claims became inconvenient. The destruction of Titulus Regius by Henry is itself suspicious, as it removed a document that had justified Richard's claim to the throne. This act of erasure raises the possibility that the truth was far more complex than the villain narrative allows. If Richard was not responsible for the prince's deaths, then much of the foundation of his infamy collapses, leaving him less a murderer and more a man crushed by circumstance and slander. What makes the debate so enduring is that Richard seems to embody both villain and victim simultaneously. He was a product of the Wars of the Roses, an age when survival demanded ruthless choices. His seizure of the throne may have been driven as much by self-preservation as by ambition, given the dominance of the Woodville faction and the precariousness of minority rule. His execution of rivals, while harsh, was not out of step with the practices of the time. Yet his defeat ensured that his reputation would be written not by sympathetic chroniclers, but by his enemies, and once Shakespeare transformed him into a stage villain, there was little chance of redemption. To call him simply a villain is to ignore his reforms, his popularity in the North, and the uncertainty surrounding the princes. To call him purely a victim is to downplay the ruthlessness of his actions and the reality that he sought and claimed power in ways that destabilized the kingdom. The most accurate view is to see him as both. He was ruthless, ambitious, and capable of cruelty, but he was also a man trapped in violent times, vilified beyond recognition by propaganda, and denied the opportunity to define his own legacy through a lasting reign. This duality explains why Richard continues to fascinate. He is not a straightforward hero or villain, but a reminder of how fragile reputations are, how easily power can turn into downfall, and how much history is shaped by those who win. His story is not only about his own life, but also about the process of historical memory, how narratives demonize or redeem, and how the truth often lies buried between extremes. Richard III is best understood not as wholly villain or wholly victim, but as a man who was both, depending on the perspective through which he is viewed. His life and reign contained elements of cruelty and ambition, but also elements of justice and reform. His legacy was darkened not only by his actions, but also by the stories told afterward. To acknowledge both sides is to do justice to the complexity of history itself. The central debate cannot be settled once and for all, but perhaps it need not be. The value lies in recognizing the tension, in understanding how Richard's story teaches us about power, propaganda, and the shaping of memory. Richard remains, and will likely always remain, a king caught between villain and victim, a figure whose legacy continues to be contested and reimagined as long as history is told.